Hey everyone, this is Ryan, and this is a Morel Dilemma bonus episode. If you've been listening, you know I try to release a bonus episode on Sundays, except for episode 5, we release the bonus right along with it. That would be the one about the Bradford Hill criteria. But I have another one up my sleeve. The series was recently featured on a local radio program called WTMJ, which is right in my home state. And we talk about why we decided to make this series in the first place, what value it has for people who are listening, and, well, a whole lot more about mushrooms and mushroom poisoning. So if you want a little behind the scenes for why I decided to make this docu-series, as well as some other really fun mushroom facts, check out this interview, which I'm going to play for you right now.
Your dad was John McCain?
Yes. My dad was a huge music fan. I'm going to tell you right now, my dad loved Willie Nelson. And people are like, you can't say you liked Willie Nelson because he dodged his taxes, blah, blah, blah. Well, he loved Willie Nelson. He did.
Everybody thinks they can do it. How can I become a professional wrestler? You really can't.
I pulled out the gun and I shot 2 times.
We have a complicated family. We were all raised to argue with each other with intensity, with passion, but also to love each other.
This is WTMJ Conversations.
Welcome to WTMJ Conversations. I'm your host, Libby Collins. Morel mushrooms are a delightful treat. In a specialty store, they can sell for $40 or more, but you might be able to find them on a nature walk right here in Wisconsin. They may even be growing in your own yard. Now, as tempting as it might seem, before bringing them home and sautéing them in butter or putting them in a stew, there's so much more to know. Joining us is Dr. Ryan Feldman. He's a poison center toxicologist, and he spent the past 2 years producing an investigative audio documentary about one of the strangest poisoning outbreaks in recent history, the Bozeman, Montana Morel mushroom outbreak. And we're going to get to that in a minute. But Ryan, first of all, how popular is foraging for mushrooms?
Oh, foraging is really incredibly popular, and I think even more so now than it has been in past years. There's a lot of really great mycological associations out there, including the Wisconsin Mycological Association, of which puts on a fantastic beginner identification course I recommend to everyone. But with the advent of things like social media, where you can share information on foraging methods and all of these great classes from local mycological societies, a lot more people are getting trained on how to find the mushrooms that they want to eat. And I really think it's becoming more prevalent, or at least we're a lot more aware of it now.
How many different kinds of mushrooms are there in Wisconsin?
Well, to give you an exact number would be hard. I would say there's somewhere between 50 and 200,000 known types of fungi, probably about 50,000 different mushrooms. And we have many of them here in Wisconsin because we have so many different types of forests, meaning so many different trees, and that leads to a really biodiverse population of mushrooms. So a lot of people actually kind of laud Wisconsin for the biodiversity of mushroom species that we have here. Compared to like San Diego, we have a lot more different types of mushroom species that you'd find here in our different forests in Wisconsin.
How many of them are edible, though?
Well, that's a really good question. So here's a fun, fast fact. You know, we got probably 50,000 different species of mushrooms, at least, and only about 200 mushrooms are known to be toxic. So your given chance on any day of picking a poisonous mushroom is pretty low, right? But the problem is they can look very similar to edible mushrooms. And when I think about the different types of toxins that are in a mushroom, even though there's 200 mushroom species that are poisonous, they really only make about 15 to 20 different poisons within them. So some of them make the same poison. And we have about 11 of those poisons here in Wisconsin, which is actually quite a lot compared to some other states.
All right, so what should you be looking for? If you decide to go out foraging, how do you know which is a good one and which is not?
You really do not. That's the thing. I've actually been on WTMJ in the past, and it was to talk about a foraging safety children's book I wrote. There is a line in there that says, if you're foraging without authority, safety is the top priority. If you're unsure, let it be. Not every shroom is lunch, you see. If you ever have to ask the question, is this edible? It's not, because the only mushroom you should eat is one you are 100% sure you know what it is. Unlike certain venomous species of animals, which might have bright colors, or even some plants that can have warning signs, there is no such thing as a poisonous-looking mushroom. They come in all shapes and sizes, and many of them have very similar poisonous lookalikes. For example, here in Wisconsin, we have something called the funeral bell. It's It's kind of a scary sounding mushroom.
What does that look like?
It's a little brown mushroom that grows on wood, and it looks a whole lot like wild enoki, which is a little brown mushroom that grows on wood. People love to pick and eat that, but a funeral bell can look just like wild enoki, and they could grow right next to each other. Sometimes they grow touching each other in some of these scenarios. I've seen some very fascinating pictures. So you really have to be clued in on the anatomy of a mushroom and the specific things to look for to differentiate them. So if you've never had any education on that, I really wouldn't recommend doing it. What you should do if you want to go out foraging is check out Wisconsin Mycological Society or your local chapter of Mycological Society. For example, here in Milwaukee, we have like UWM as a Mycological Society. And work with someone who has gone before. There's plenty of guides out there who can help you understand what to look for. And you want to learn from someone who's probably done it before and used a reliable field guide.
Coming up on WTMJ Conversations.
It can, in the right circumstances, look a lot like a morel. But the false morel is well known to contain a toxin, which can cause seizures and actually maybe ALS.
Poison-centered toxicologist Ryan Feldman explains the difference between a true and a false morel mushroom.
Now, more of WTMJ Conversations.
Welcome back. I'm Libby Collins. We're talking with poison-centered toxicologist Ryan Feldman. Your audio documentary is on morel mushroom. About a year ago, in my yard, I thought I saw a morel. I was tempted. I really was, but I didn't know. So I just let it be there. Now, are the mushrooms in Wisconsin that look like morels, are they really morels?
So there are plenty of true morels here in Wisconsin. There are also false morels here in Wisconsin.
So it was a good idea that I didn't do anything with that.
Well, especially if you're not sure. Morels are, interestingly, some of the most distinctive mushrooms. They look very clearly unlike any other mushroom. They're called an ascomycete, which means a cup fungus. And if you look at them, it's like somebody glued a bunch of misshapen cups together. You really have to look at it. It's like a honeycomb on top of a stalk. They don't look like your typical mushroom you would think of. So that's genus Morchella. There's another mushroom, which is in the family Discinae, but it has a bunch of wrinkled caps, and it can, in the right circumstances, look a lot like a morel. There's some easy ways to differentiate them. For example, if you cut the false morel in half, its stem will be full all the way through, versus the morel is actually hollow-stemmed. So those are some easy ways, and there's a few other ways to differentiate them. But the false morel is well known to contain a toxin called gyromitrin, which can cause seizures and actually maybe ALS if you eat it chronically. So there's very good reason to not want to eat false morels. And if you can't figure out which one it is, you probably shouldn't be doing that.
I would imagine there aren't a whole lot of toxicologists in Wisconsin.
There are not. I can't give you the full number, but it's under 20, I'm sure.
So how often do you get reports of mushroom poisoning here in the state?
So from May through October, we get about one call every other day at the Poison Center from somebody who foraged a mushroom and ate it and now is either having symptoms or is worried that they ate a poisonous one.
What kind of symptoms?
There's about 11 different poisons we have here in Wisconsin. The most common thing with all of them is nausea and vomiting. And that's in almost every mushroom poison in Wisconsin. You're probably going to develop some kind of nausea or vomiting. And then it can range all the way from nausea and vomiting, and that's it, to liver failure. And we've had deaths here in Wisconsin from those types of mushrooms that cause very severe liver failure. It can range to ones that contain a toxin that looks very much like nerve gas, if you've ever heard of that. So what happens is your lungs fill up with fluid and your heart can actually stop, and we've unfortunately had deaths from those as well. It's not like we're having this happen all the time, but we have had deaths from foraging in Wisconsin. And about every other day from May through October, we get a call at the Poison Center from someone who took a bite of a mushroom they found somewhere, and either they're worried about it or they're having symptoms.
Can one little bite make you that sick?
Well, it depends on the mushroom, but yeah, some of them have enough toxin in a bite to cause problems.
Now, are these individuals who you're hearing from, are they experienced foragers, or is this just somebody who said, oh, look, I think that's a morel in my backyard. I'll pick it and I'll try eating it?
It's all over the board, and preparation plays a big role. Even if you're an experienced forager, there are some mushrooms where if you don't prepare them correctly, you can actually still get sick. An example is the morel mushroom. It's been long known that they can cause nausea and vomiting if they're eaten raw, like uncooked. It's actually the second most common genus of mushroom we get called about in Wisconsin is the morel mushroom. Because people who know they're morels, they know them. Just like you saw one in your yard. You say, well, that's a morel, right?
I think.
Right. But there's people who, they're kind of diehards about this. And they end up going to the hospital. Oftentimes, either it's undercooked or raw. Never eat a raw mushroom that you picked off the ground. There's dirt, bacteria, and some of them may have heat labile toxins that need to be cooked off. But in terms of the experience, there are people who are experienced foragers. Whether you're a forager or not, your toddler is, right? They're going to go out and find a mushroom in the yard and take a bite of it. So we get a lot of calls about that. And fortunately, those almost always do okay. I really get more concerned if somebody makes a meal of a poisonous mushroom. Like we said, a bite is possible, but I've not really the ones where I see someone get really sick, you're usually eating at least a whole mushroom. Not to say that one bite can't do anything. We do have a lot of people with just incomplete information about foraging, where they believe they have the right training, or actually what's really common, this has been shown in a few different studies, immigrant groups that in their native country, there's a certain mushroom that they eat all the time, and it's very safe. It's part of their food culture. And then they move to a new country like the U.S., and suddenly we have a mushroom that looks a lot like it, but it's fatally poisonous. And that has played a role in an outbreak going on in California right now with death cap mushrooms, if you ever heard of those. They're one of the most deadly mushrooms out there.
What do they look like?
They are big. They have a sickly green cap. It invokes the feeling of death. But then they are actually a big white stalked mushroom with white gills and a white annulus and a big ball. But they're big mushrooms, and the top is just kind of has a green tint to them. We actually don't have those here in Wisconsin, but we do have their cousin, which is the destroying angel. Right? The names are pretty interesting. But
I think that's a warning sign.
Yeah, that's certainly someone's trying to tell you something. Yeah, so here in Wisconsin, so the death cap contains a toxin called amatoxin. Okay? This destroys your liver. The death cap is an invasive species from pine farms. So it ended up here in the U.S. with pine farms. So it's only on the east and west coast because that's where pine farms are imported. Right now in California, in the last 8 months, there have been 4 deaths and 4 liver transplants from death cap mushrooms because they kind of had a super bloom where they were growing in places where they don't normally and in a longer period than they do. And a fair number of people misforaged them thinking they were something called Amanita vernicocora, which is the spring Amanita mushroom. It looks so much like the death cap. It's really hard to tell the difference. But that mushroom is eaten pretty commonly in places like Mexico. So a fair amount of people who were affected were non-native English speakers. I know that for sure. There's more published about this in the California Department of Health. And this is a risk factor that's been identified in other studies. So that's a big problem. Mushrooms are not all the same. Even if you move to a couple states away, they can change a little bit. And what you're used to eating might now be a poisonous mushroom in a new state or look enough like it.
Coming up on WTMJ Conversations.
We eventually tracked down that it was related to a contaminant in THC vapes called vitamin E acetate, that when you burn it, it turns into a toxic gas in the lungs and scars the lungs.
Poison Center toxicologist Ryan Feldman explains how an outbreak of poison vapes was uncovered here in Wisconsin.
You're listening to WTMJ Conversations.
I'm your host, Libby Collins. Let's return to our conversation with Poison Center toxicologist Ryan Feldman. I want to talk about your audio documentary because this is something that happened in recent history. I think it was 2023, and it's the Bozeman, Montana Morel mushroom outbreak. What was it about this that attracted your attention?
I am one of the few people who gets called when there's a mushroom poisoning. There's not that many people who deal with this. And I have taught about mushroom poisoning for the last almost decade. Morel mushrooms were never on that list. There has never been a death from a morel mushroom ever until 2023. We know they can cause nausea and vomiting if eaten raw, okay? But that's happened, as far as I'm aware, forever. It's not a new thing. So why in 2023 do we suddenly have not just 2 deaths from a mass poisoning outbreak where they believed it was linked to morel mushrooms, but then actually we found another death and a few more. And this kind of uncovered a question of mine, which was this something we were missing all along, or are things changing? Is something else happening here? Now, maybe to take a step back here to help explain why I did the documentary, one of my favorite things to do is help treat poisoned patients. It's really rewarding to help change the outcome of a serious poisoning. But that's my second favorite thing to do. My first favorite thing to do is talk about treating poison patients, because it's all the fun of thinking about how to prevent these bad things without anyone's actual life or limb on the line. So about 5 years ago, I started a podcast called The Poison Lab, which is just a way for me to talk with other toxicologists about poisoning and how we treat it and ways we could do it better.
These are other kinds of poisons, not all mushrooms.
Oh, yeah. Mushrooms are probably a 1% of what we deal with. And I'll say that straight out. I may be the nerdiest toxicologist about mushrooms in the area, but mushrooms are still only 1%, if that, of the job. Another thing I started doing with this podcast is, I don't know if you know this, but Wisconsin has a bit of a history with mass poisoning outbreaks. So, for example, have you ever heard of e-cigarette and vape-associated lung injury?
I have not.
So about 6 years ago, we realized teenagers were getting really sick from using vapes, and some of them needed lung transplants. We called it EVALI. That was the name it got called. This was right before COVID, so everyone kind of forgot about it after that. Wisconsin helped identify that mass poisoning that was a mass poisoning throughout the entire United States. We eventually tracked down that it was related to a contaminant in THC vapes called vitamin E acetate, that when you burn it, it turns into a toxic gas in the lungs and scars the lungs. But we were involved in that, and I was there, getting calls about people developing mystery symptoms, and we didn't know what was going on. We've also had a rat poison that made its way into synthetic cannabis. They call it spice. This was back in 2017, but people were smoking this synthetic cannabis, and then they would show up to the ER bleeding from everywhere because there was a rat poison in there. We're like, what is going on? That was another mass poisoning event that actually started in Chicago, but a number of patients were tracked here in Wisconsin too. So I've been in some mass poisonings in terms of being a clinician to help treat patients during those things. And I've realized that each one of these events is what you would call a halo event, or high acuity, low occurrence, meaning when it happens, life or limbs are on the line, right? People are bleeding or people are needing lung transplants, but it's low occurrence. So the people who have to step in and try to figure out what happened, what is causing it, and how to treat it, they don't really get to practice it very much. So I started a podcast series where I interviewed other people involved in mass poisonings to hear their story of what they did, so that we could share the information and that everybody could learn a little bit more about how to better manage the next poisoning outbreak. Because believe me, we have lots of them.
Still ahead on WTMJ Conversations.
They used to largely be you would buy them from a forager if you were a local restaurant. But the way that we get our mushrooms has changed.
Poison Center toxicologist Ryan Feldman says, be careful where you buy your mushrooms.
Now, more of WTMJ Conversations.
And I'm Libby Collins. Our guest today is Poison Center toxicologist Ryan Feldman. Let's go back then to the Bozeman morel mushroom outbreak. Who were the people involved? And I'm not talking about the clinicians. I'm talking about the people who died from this or who became very ill. Were they experienced foragers?
So this actually occurred from a restaurant that served the morel mushrooms in one of their dishes. So the people involved were every patron who went to the restaurant. Now, a lot of restaurants serve morels. I don't want to scare people away from eating morels. When appropriately cooked, they're delicious. This restaurant appeared to have served them undercooked.
This is in Bozeman,
Montana.
Okay.
And
what was the dish?
it was a sushi dish, which makes some sense.
Sushi is
right?
generally not cooked.
Yeah, generally. But there's a whole bunch of questions that come to my mind first before I land on a morel mushroom, even if it caused nausea and vomit.
Especially in a sushi restaurant.
Right, exactly. I mean, what comes to your mind first if I say...
It was probably something with some uncooked
fish
tuna or
exactly.
salmon or whatever.
Exactly. So I said, well, how did they really rule everything out? How did they land on the morel? Did they do all the tests to make sure it wasn't bacteria and all this other stuff? Because morels have never killed anyone before. So I'm reading this CDC report, and I just decide to email the people who wrote the report. And I say, hey, I have a series where I interview people about public health outbreaks. I'm really interested in yours. So the public health investigator from Montana, the state public health investigator, and the local one were like, sure, we would love to get the word out about this. The CDC was actually pulled into this. And I was like, do you think we can get the CDC investigator? And they were like, we'll reach out. And it turns out he actually listens to my podcast. So he was like, yeah, let's do it, which I think was hilarious. But he was actually so valuable.
Was it over just a one-day period, or was it over an extended period of time?
So it turns out there was 2 separate days where they served this morel mushroom dish. And people got sick some days, but the very severe outbreak happened on one specific of those 2 days. And it might have had to do with the preparation of the morels. It seemed to be undercooked on that day.
So it was a cooked morel.
Partially on one of the days. It gets into it in the podcast. It explains a little bit more about this and all the preparation.
Did you talk to the chef?
I didn't talk to the chef. I talked to the people who did the investigation with the chef, and they learned all about how they cooked it and everything. I'm going to preface this. Part of this story of this docuseries is to tell the story of the outbreak. So I don't want to give too much away.
You're just going to tease us.
Everything is out there as public record. You can look up the CDC report. If you just Google CDC morel mushroom, it'll pop right up.
Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Did they get the mushrooms from a place that sells them all over? Or was it a single person that went out foraging for morels? Where did these mushrooms come from?
These are all questions that come up in this podcast. Because, right, that's your first thought. What if it's not a morel? These were morels purchased from a distributor.
Oh.
But did you know that the FDA in the 90s did an audit of morel mushrooms coming in from other countries, and 20% of them had false morel contamination in them? So it doesn't necessarily
So
matter.
if you're buying morels at a specialty store, because they're not usually at the Piggly Wiggly, do they come from foreign countries, or are they all sourced in the United States?
So the way that we get our mushrooms has changed. Morels are notoriously hard to grow. You know, most mushrooms you buy, like most of your white button mushroom, you're probably getting that from a mushroom farm.
Portobellos.
Yeah. And white button mushrooms and portobellos are the same mushroom. They're just harvested at different times. But the morels, they used to largely be, you would buy them from a forager if you were a local restaurant. And I think a lot of places in, say, Milwaukee probably do that. But if you are buying them from a distributor, they are likely coming from cultivation farms in China where they've figured out how to actually grow them on a farm, which is a really hard thing to do. It's not generally financially viable to do, but they've figured out how to do it in China. So that's brought up some questions. You know, when I heard about this outbreak, I said, okay, well, how do we know it wasn't a false morel? That's, you know, was a forager bringing in a false morel, or did it get into the food supply? Or how do we know it wasn't like a spice that was contaminated with a toxic chemical? Because literally in Canada, just 2 years ago, a huge outbreak of poisoning. They thought they were using sand ginger powder at this restaurant, and it ended up being one of the most fatal toxins known as aconite that got put in there on accident. The distributor
How many people died from that outbreak?
I think 12 people were hospitalized, 2 or 3 were in the ICU with life-threatening arrhythmias. They actually managed to save everyone, which is incredible. And I actually interviewed the team who did that. That's one of the, when I talked about kind of some of these poisoning outbreak episodes I've done. I mean, that was really wild. But that's another, when you hear about this, you're like, well, how do you land on the morel when there's all these other products in there? So that's part of what this investigation is taking people in from the perspective of it unfolding in real time, and we hear about their theories and how they ruled them out.
Were the people who became the most ill, did they have other compromising medical conditions?
That's another thing that we think about. The CDC report mentions 2 of them potentially had underlying medical conditions that may have made them more sensitive. However, there's a lot more to learn as to why one person would get sick versus another.
So not everybody who had the morel dish became ill?
Correct. And not everybody who became ill had the morels. So how do you pin it on the morel? And that's what we get
Wait, so there were people who also were involved in this outbreak of being ill, but they didn't have morels?
Yes.
They didn't even say to their partner, can I just try that? Can I have a little bite?
Right. Well, as far as we know, obviously there's limitations with doing like a survey after somebody ate. Are they going to remember everything they ate? But that's part of it. So it was like, well, okay, I'm reading the CDC report. There's some people who got sick. They didn't eat morels. There's some people who ate morels. They didn't get sick. We have a whole episode dedicated to explaining that. Let me just take the punch out of it right away. I will be thoroughly cooking any morel I ever eat for the rest of my life, and I would never touch one raw. Let me make sure that
Where do you
clear.
get your morels?
Oh, well, if I could find them.
You go out looking?
I go out foraging once in a
Okay.
while. Like, I go looking for mushrooms. I honestly rarely eat anything I would pick. I just appreciate the beauty of them. I know there's some great local mushroom companies that sell, I see them at farmers market all the time. So if you really want some, go check out those.
And they have morels?
Oftentimes I see they have morels when it's in season.
Coming up on WTMJ Conversations,
Oh, you can't give those secrets away. They don't want anyone else to find their morel spot.
Poison Center toxicologist Ryan Feldman says, don't even try to ask a forager where he finds his mushrooms.
You're listening to WTMJ Conversations.
Welcome back to our conversation with Poison Center toxicologist Ryan Feldman. I'm your host, Libby Collins. If you were going to look for a morel around here, other than at the farmer's market, where would you look?
Oh, you can't give those secrets away. You're never allowed to ask a forager where they got their
Oh,
morels.
you're not?
Yeah, that's a secret because they don't want anyone else to find their morel spot. Now, I'm lucky because I don't actually know where they are. So I've never found any morels, so I don't have to give away a spot. But that's the secret in all foraging communities. Don't ask them where they found the morels.
What has been the reaction to this series so far?
Oh, it has been. So we're on episode 3 right now. By the time this comes out, it'll probably be closer to episode, I assume, 5 or 6, where we're going to answer a lot of the questions you just brought up. Well, how could some people get sick, but they didn't eat the morel? How do we know it wasn't the false morel? The series releases weekly, and it addresses all of these questions that I had as a toxicologist who helps treat not only mass poisonings, but mushroom poisonings. And I hear it directly from the people who did it. Not only that, we hear from the people who got sick. I've kind of just reached out to some Bozeman communities online and said, has anyone impacted on this? Do you want to share your experience? And we hear from someone who lost his wife, a son who lost his mother. These people hear about these headlines online, and as someone who's been part of, the treatment team for mass poisonings, a lot of people hear those, oh, it's a news story far away. Well, this could have happened anywhere, and it's real people. And it's really important to honor their stories of loss and understand the impact that this has on communities afterwards. That's all part of this series, too. That's why I wanted to do this and tell it as a story, to give people an understanding of the stakes that are really there when these mass poisonings happen, and why it is so important that we have the infrastructure available to respond to them. I mean, it's part me honestly trying to solve a medical mystery, and it is part showcasing who steps in when people start dying of mysterious symptoms in your local town.
You bring up the local aspect. Aside from mushrooms, what are you most concerned that people might ingest? Especially if they're not preparing the food themselves, if they're dining out. I mean, what sort of illnesses do you see in your toxicology clinic?
I work in an emergency department and I work in a poison center. And we see all sorts of things. In the emergency department, there's more adults being exposed to illicit substances or self-harm related to ingesting prescription medications or non-prescription medications, chemicals, things like that. But it's about 50% of what I deal with are adults who either took something to injure themselves or had an accidental double dose of a medication, and they're now maybe experiencing, medication errors, things like that. Those are all big things too. In the kids side, it is less medication. I mean, that's about 50% of the calls is kids. It's more exploratory ingestions to things, plants, mushrooms, chemicals.
Will kids eat a lot of those things that they see outside?
Oh,
pick a flower and eat it?
I have a 1-year-old daughter, and I catch her outside of my yard, and I will have to squeeze her cheeks and be like, cough it up. What's in there? She has got 4 leaves stuffed in her mouth, and I'm just like, what is going on here? Kids love to eat just anything they can find. And I am sometimes baffled by how much of it they try to eat.
What's the most unusual thing have you seen a child ingest that caused a poison reaction?
It's honestly hard to say. And what excites me probably excites people less. I get excited about things where we can do really unique things to help treat them. But let me just say it's very common to see kids getting into things like laundry detergent pods, which are big.
That really happens?
Oh, all the time. And it's very scary when it does, because those are big, brightly colored pods. And when you take a bite out of them, they're pressurized. Now you pop it, it shoots liquid back into their throat and it gets into their lungs. And they can no longer breathe well. A lot of times they can get intubated, which is where we have to put a breathing tube in, and they develop chemical pneumonia.
So you see this quite frequently?
Oh, this is certainly something that happens not infrequently. It's not the most common thing, but it's happened enough that it scares me. Kids getting into THC edibles is through the roof these days. It's pretty hard to, especially here in Wisconsin, where we have no regulations around the total amount of THC you can have in some of the products that are out there. So, you get kids eating a 4,000 milligram chocolate bar. That's enough to put an adult
or
in
a
the
gummy
hospital.
or something like that.
And they end up in the hospital for several days. Usually doing okay with good supportive care, good supportive medical care, but certainly scary when, especially if you don't know they ate it. And some of these kids end up getting lumbar punctures and things to rule out meningitis. It's kind of scary. We see lots of kids eat medicines, chemicals. They take sips of chemicals here and there. So we always say, up and away is the rule of thumb. Keep anything that could potentially be dangerous up, out of their reach, and locked away if you can. Because it's a very, things that really scare me, things like tiki torch fluid, that actually ends up being one of the things that can either kill or cause a child to be intubated for several days because it's really volatile. And if you take a sip of it, you're very likely to aspirate on it, meaning it goes down your breathing tube instead of your stomach tube. And when it gets in the lungs, it just causes a really long delayed pneumonia. And that can cause big problems for kids. Obviously opioid medication, there's certain cough medications that can be dangerous. Tylenol is still one of the number one causes of poisoning death throughout the United States. Fortunately, it's less common. We see it in kids. It's usually in adults overusing it on accident. So people really need to follow those over-the-counter instructions when they read them or ask their pharmacist. But there's, as I said, mushrooms are 1% of what I deal with, but I deal with a lot of medicines, chemicals, and illegal drugs that people are using. And unfortunately, the illicit drug supply has a lot of problems because, people are using one dose of a drug they're buying from someone, and then that person they're buying it from gets a different batch that's much more potent, and suddenly that person overdoses. So I think everybody knows opioid overdose deaths are through the roof.
Coming up on WTMJ Conversations.
There's a lab in Wisconsin that's working on getting psilocybin FDA approved for depression. But with the increase in interest in psilocybin as a medical therapy, there's more and more people taking it.
Poison Center toxicologist Ryan Feldman says there's a lot to be learned about magic mushrooms.
Now, more of WTMJ Conversations.
I'm Libby Collins. Today's conversation is with Poison Center toxicologist Ryan Feldman. I know you've worked for over 2 years on this Bozeman Morel mushroom outbreak broadcast. What are you working on now?
Well, right now, I've kind of taken a mushroom bend in my last 2 years. So I've done a lot of mushroom-related things, and I'm currently working on a couple of episodes for this series that are related to, unsurprisingly, mushroom poisoning. We have some other things that we hear about in this series, actually, at least pieces of it. For example, those false morels I told you about. It turns out there's this small mountain town in France where ALS rates, that's Lou Gehrig's disease, a really tragic, universally fatal disease about 3 to 5 years after diagnosis usually. Well, the rates of Lou Gehrig's disease in the small mountain town, about 1,500 times that of the world. They had 14 people out of 200 versus the world, it's 1.5 out of 100,000. And
they've all been exposed to morel mushrooms?
Well, that was one of their first thoughts, but it turns out it's probably false morel mushrooms. So actually, in the podcast documentary series, after we kind of go through the initial outbreak, we start to ask questions, are there other mushrooms that are developing new toxicities? And that is one that we bring up. So I actually interview the people who spent 20 years in this mountain town linking false morel mushrooms to ALS. And what's fascinating is the way they did it, is that Guam also had an ALS outbreak, but they found it was related to a plant they eat called the cycad. And the cycad has a molecule in it called cycazin. They think that's part of what causes ALS. Well, one of the researchers there was like, hey, this cycazin molecule looks a lot like that molecule that's in a false morel called gyromitrin. Oh, hey, aren't there a bunch of people in France who have ALS from eating mushrooms? We should find out what mushroom that is. And then suddenly 100% of them reported false morels. It was very, very interesting. And then there's other mushrooms. So another kind of episode I'm working on putting out is psilocybin. I'm sure you've heard of. A lot of people know of psilocybin, magic mushrooms.
I've heard of them. I've never had one.
Don't worry. Not asking. But these are very big right now. In fact, Wisconsin, there's a lab in Wisconsin that's working on getting psilocybin FDA approved. It's very exciting for depression. There's some really interesting data around it. But with the increase in interest in psilocybin as a medical therapy, there's more and more people taking it from just mushrooms they find. And there's a new syndrome we've found called wood lovers paralysis, which is when people take psilocybin mushrooms from certain species of psilocybin, just 6 out of the 200 species, that these specific ones that grow on woods, they're all in kind of called sub-aeruginosa, is the psilocybe sub-aeruginosa is the name. They tend to cause people to have, and just sometimes, profound weakness to the point where some of them stop breathing and need to get breathing tubes. And this is a new phenomenon we haven't seen. It's only been reported in Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, as far as I'm aware. But it's new. We didn't know about this 100 years ago when we knew about all the other mushroom poisons. So it's bringing up a question. This series starts to explore, well, are things changing? Are some mushrooms developing different toxicities? And if so, why? Is it something in the mushroom? Is it a genetic mutation? Is it something to do with the way that we're cultivating them? Could that lead to changes? And it explores all these hypotheses with the researchers who are identifying and exploring them with their science. And that's what's really interesting.
All I know is before I have another mushroom, I think I'm going to listen to the Poison Lab podcast. Dr. Ryan Feldman, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Check out A Morel Dilemma at thepoisonlab.com if you want to learn more about all of this.
We've been talking with Poison Center toxicologist Ryan Feldman. He has a podcast where he uncovered a story about a poison morel mushroom outbreak in Bozeman, Montana. But he also works here in Wisconsin, and he shared a lot of information about what he sees in the Poison Center and also what to beware of, especially when it comes to foraging mushrooms. Now, if you joined us late and you want to hear our entire conversation with Ryan, go to WTMJ.com and share today's show with your friends and family. You'll also find a partial transcript courtesy of eCourt reporters. For WTMJ Conversations, I'm Libby Collins.
Okay, we'll see you at the next episode of A Morel Dilemma.
6 people are now dead.
Investigators are focused on a spice that should never have been in food.
And state health officials are now working with federal agencies to